The recess lasted only 30 minutes, but Jake could feel the shift in atmosphere when the council reconvened. Representatives who had entered the chamber as members of a unified alliance now sat in distinct groups, their body language suggesting internal divisions and private negotiations. The careful coordination that had marked the previous session had dissolved into individual species calculating their own interests. Representative Kethvar of the Zephyrians was the first to speak when the session resumed. His tentacles moved in formal patterns that indicated official policy statements. The Zephyrian Federation has received new instructions from our home government, he announced. We are withdrawing from the alliance and request immediate private negotiations with the human delegation regarding mutual defense agreements. The statement hit the chamber like a physical shock. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the observing delegations, while several species began rapid communications with their own governments. The Zephyrians had been one of the founding members of the anti-human alliance, and their sudden reversal suggested that other defections might follow. Council leader Zalthek's crystalline form shifted through color patterns that indicated deep agitation. The Veltar had invested significant political capital in organizing the alliance, and its collapse would damage their influence throughout the galactic community. The Zephyrian delegation cannot simply withdraw from agreed-upon positions, he protested. This council was convened to address the human threat through coordinated action. The threat assessment has changed, Kethvar replied calmly. Human military doctrine is defensive rather than expansionist. The Zephyrian Federation sees no benefit in continued hostility toward a species whose primary military objective is protecting their own people. Ambassador Felnara of the Centauri Federation spoke from the observer section. The Centauri Federation formally requests to participate in negotiations with the human delegation, she said. We are interested in mutual defense treaties with a species that demonstrates such commitment to protecting their people. Jake remained standing in the center of the chamber, but he could see the political landscape shifting around him with remarkable speed. Species that had viewed humanity as a threat were beginning to see potential advantages in alliance with forces that never abandoned their commitments. The same military capabilities that had frightened them as offensive weapons were now attractive as defensive guarantees. The Veltar delegation began harmonizing in complex patterns that grew increasingly discordant as their internal discussion intensified. After several minutes, Zalthek spoke again, his voice showing strain that translated as uncertainty in his crystalline communications. The Veltar Consortium also requests private negotiations with the human delegation, he said. Our concerns about human military expansion have been addressed by today's revelations. General Vraktar of the Drakmori rose from his seat with violent force, his scaled form radiating anger. This council dissolves into cowardice, he hissed. The humans have done nothing but speak words, yet species flee from coordinated action, like prey animals avoiding predators. The Karathi delegate turned her compound eyes toward the Drakmori general. The hive mind has recalculated probability matrices, she said in her translated mechanical voice. Human military doctrine creates strategic unpredictability that exceeds acceptable operational parameters. The Karathi withdraw from the alliance. 4 species had now abandoned the alliance in less than an hour. Jake watched the political collapse with something approaching amazement. He had hoped to avoid military confrontation by explaining human motivations, but he had not expected such a complete reversal of galactic opinion. The simple 12-second audio clip had accomplished more than years of traditional diplomacy might have achieved. The Nethex pulsed with electromagnetic patterns that indicated complex calculations. As energy beings who thought in mathematical terms, they were reassessing the strategic situation based on new variables. Revised analysis indicates mutual benefit potential in human alliance structures, they announced. The Nethek Collective requests inclusion in negotiation processes. Only the Drakmori delegation remained committed to the original alliance objectives. General Vraktar looked around the chamber at the species that had been his partners only hours earlier, his expression showing a mixture of rage and calculation. The collapse of the alliance meant that any action against humanity would have to be taken by the Drakmori Empire alone, facing potential opposition from their former partners. The Drakmori Empire does not require allies to deal with a single primitive species, Vraktar declared. Human military capabilities are insignificant compared to our superior technology and numbers. Jake finally spoke again, his voice calm despite the importance of the moment. General Vraktar, he said, I hope that won't be necessary. The Drakmori Empire has many enemies throughout the galaxy. Wouldn't it be better to have allies who will never abandon you than to face those enemies alone? The offer was unexpected and diplomatically brilliant. Jake was suggesting that the same human commitment that had frightened the Alliance could benefit the Drakmori if they chose cooperation over conflict. The general's scaled features showed surprise at the possibility, followed quickly by suspicion about human motivations. The Drakmori do not require protection from inferior species, Vraktar replied, but his tone lacked the absolute confidence he had shown earlier. Everyone requires protection sometimes, Jake said gently. The difference is whether your allies will be there when you need them. The chamber fell silent as representatives processed the implications of Jake's words. Human military doctrine meant that any species allied with humanity could count on absolute support in times of crisis. No strategic calculations about acceptable losses, no abandonment when the cost became too high, no withdrawal when victory seemed unlikely. For species that had experienced betrayal by allies in the past, the guarantee was powerfully attractive. Ambassador. Felnara spoke again from the observer section. Captain Morrison, she said, the Centauri Federation would like to propose a formal treaty structure. We are prepared to offer mutual defense agreements with guaranteed response provisions. Other species began making similar offers. The Altarian delegation, the hegemony representatives, even some of the smaller civilizations that had remained neutral throughout the crisis began requesting private negotiations. Word was spreading throughout Nexus Station that humanity was offering alliance terms based on absolute commitment rather than strategic convenience. Jake looked around the chamber at the dozens of species now seeking partnership with Earth. The confrontation that had begun as an ultimatum demanding human submission had transformed into a diplomatic opportunity beyond anything he had imagined. The 12 seconds of audio had not only avoided war, but had positioned humanity as the most reliable ally in the galaxy. The human delegation will be happy to begin negotiations with any species interested in mutual cooperation, Jake announced. We believe that civilizations built on trust and mutual commitment can accomplish things that fear-based alliances never could. General Vraktar remained standing in the Drakmori section, his delegation now isolated among species that had been their allies only hours earlier. The political calculation was obvious. The Drakmori Empire could continue their aggressive stance and face humanity alone, or they could reconsider their position and join the new alliance structure that was forming around human military guarantees. The Drakmori Empire requires time to consider our position, Vraktar said finally. It was as close to a concession as his species ever made, and everyone in the chamber understood the significance. Jake nodded respectfully. "Of course, General. The offer remains open whenever you're ready to discuss it." Council leader Zalthek called for a formal end to the alliance session and began scheduling private negotiation meetings between the human delegation and the various species that had requested them. The chamber slowly emptied as representatives returned to their ships to consult with their governments about the new political possibilities. Jake remained on the chamber floor until the last alien delegation had departed. The confrontation that had threatened human civilization had ended not with military victory or diplomatic compromise, but with a fundamental shift in how other species viewed humanity's place in the galaxy. The simple promise that humans never abandon their people had proven more powerful than any weapon or threat. Commander Lisa Parker met Jake at the chamber entrance, her expression showing relief mixed with amazement. "The intelligence reports are coming in from across the station," she said. 17 species have requested formal negotiations, and 3 more are considering military cooperation agreements. The Drakmori fleet is maintaining position, but has stopped making aggressive maneuvers. Jake walked beside her toward the docking bay where the UNS Liberty waited. "It worked better than I hoped," he admitted. "I thought we might avoid a war. I didn't expect to gain this many potential allies. The galaxy is full of species that have been abandoned by their partners." The council chamber remained silent for long minutes after Jake finished speaking. Representatives from dozens of species sat motionless in their seats, processing the implications of what they had just heard. The simple 12-second audio clip had revealed something about human nature that no amount of technical documentation could have explained. Humans were not building a military for conquest, but for the absolute protection of their own. The Veltar delegation was the first to show visible reaction. Their crystalline forms began resonating at frequencies that created subtle musical tones throughout the chamber. Zalthek's body shifted through different color patterns as he consulted with his advisors through harmonic communication. The patterns grew more complex as the discussion continued, indicating deep consideration of new information. Representative Kethvar of the Zephyrians moved his tentacles in slow, thoughtful patterns. His aquatic species had evolved in environments where cooperation was essential for survival, and they understood the value of group loyalty. However, the absolute nature of the human commitment was beyond their experience. Zephyrian military doctrine allowed for strategic retreats and acceptable casualties when the greater good required sacrifice. The Korathi delegate remained perfectly still, her compound eyes fixed on Jake. The hive mind species was processing the human concept through millions of individual nodes, each one analyzing the strategic implications. For creatures who existed as part of a collective consciousness, the idea of risking the many for the few was fundamentally alien. Individual units were expendable components of a larger organism, not irreplaceable individuals worth unlimited sacrifice. General Vraktar of the Drakmori was the first to break the silence. His scaled features showed confusion mixed with something that might have been concern. "This doctrine is strategically unsound," he said, but his voice lacked the confidence he had shown earlier. "Military forces operating under such constraints cannot achieve efficient victory conditions." Jake nodded. "You're right," he said. "Efficient victory was never the goal. The goal is to win without losing anyone, or if that's impossible, to make sure everyone comes home eventually." The Nethex pulsed with electromagnetic patterns that indicated rapid calculation. As energy beings who thought in terms of mathematical relationships, They were trying to model the strategic implications of human military doctrine. This creates exponential resource requirements, they observed. Each rescue operation potentially requires resources equivalent to major fleet actions. Sometimes, more than that, Jake agreed. We've sent entire battle groups to recover single individuals. We've fought wars to get prisoners back. We've spent decades searching for missing personnel. The alien representatives began exchanging rapid communications in their various languages. The chamber filled with electronic pulses, harmonic resonances, clicking sounds, and other forms of non-vocal communication as different species processed this information. Several delegations activated private communication channels to consult with their home governments about the unexpected revelation. Ambassador Felnara of the Centauri Federation, a species that had remained neutral in the alliance, spoke for the first time. "Captain Morrison," she said, "you are describing military capabilities far beyond what would be needed for territorial defense. If your forces are designed for unlimited rescue operations, they could overwhelm most existing defensive arrangements." Jake considered his response carefully. The ambassador had identified the real issue that worried many species about human military expansion. Forces capable of impossible rescue missions were also capable of impossible offensive operations. "That's correct," he said. "But the same principle that drives us to build those capabilities also prevents us from using them for conquest. We don't leave our people behind, but we also don't attack others unless they threaten our people first." The distinction seemed important to several species. The Altarian observer delegation, bird-like creatures who valued honor and loyalty, began chirping among themselves in patterns that indicated approval. Their own military traditions emphasized protecting the flock, though not to the absolute degree that humans practiced. Representative Kethvar raised a tentacle to request attention. This philosophy explains human trade and diplomatic behavior. "As well," he said, "human merchant vessels are escorted by warships even in peaceful territory. Human colonies maintain defensive capabilities far beyond their strategic value. Human diplomatic missions include military personnel as standard procedure, because we protect our people," Jake confirmed. "Everywhere they go, whatever they do, they know that Earth stands behind them. That knowledge lets human traders operate in dangerous sectors, lets our diplomats take risks that others won't take, lets our explorers push into unknown territory." The Karathi delegate finally spoke again, her translated voice carrying overtones of confusion. "This creates psychological advantages that cannot be quantified in standard strategic analysis," she said. "Human individuals operate with confidence, levels that exceed rational risk assessment parameters." Jake smiled slightly. "Fear changes behavior," he said. "When people know they might be abandoned if things go wrong, they make different choices than people who know rescue is guaranteed. Our soldiers fight harder because they trust their comrades. Our civilians take bigger risks because they trust their military. Our entire civilization operates on the assumption that we take care of each other." General Vraktar stood abruptly, his massive form casting shadows across the chamber floor. "This is weakness disguised as strength," he declared. "Military forces bound by such limitations cannot achieve decisive victories. The Drakmori Empire has conquered half the galaxy by accepting necessary sacrifices for strategic objectives." "And how many of your soldiers trust their commanders?" Jake asked quietly. The question seemed to hit the Drakmori general like a physical blow. His scaled features shifted through expressions of anger and calculation before settling into something resembling uncertainty. The Drakmori military was built on fear and dominance, with officers who routinely sacrificed subordinates for tactical advantage. Loyalty flowed upward through force and intimidation, not downward through mutual commitment. The chamber fell silent again as representatives considered the implications. Military forces built on trust and absolute loyalty would behave differently than forces built on fear and acceptable casualties. Human soldiers would take risks that others would consider suicidal because they knew someone would come for them if things went wrong. They would also fight more desperately to protect their comrades because abandonment was not an option. Ambassador Felnara spoke again. This doctrine explains why human forces have been so effective against pirate operations, she observed. Pirates rely on their opponents calculating acceptable losses and withdrawing when casualties become too expensive. Humans apparently do not make such calculations. That's right, Jake confirmed. Pirates expect their targets to give up when the cost of fighting becomes too high. Human military doctrine doesn't include giving up as an option. We keep fighting until everyone comes home or until there's no one left to fight. The psychological implications were beginning to register with species that understood warfare primarily as a strategic calculation. Most galactic civilizations approached military conflict as a form of complex negotiation, with acceptable casualties and withdrawal conditions predetermined based on rational analysis. The discovery that humans operated without such limitations was profoundly disturbing to races that relied on predictable strategic behavior. The Zephyrians were the first delegation to show signs of reconsideration. Representative Kethvar began, moving his tentacles in patterns that indicated withdrawal from aggressive positions. His species had joined the alliance primarily because they feared human military expansion, but the revelation that human forces were designed for protection rather than conquest changed their strategic assessment. The Zephyrian delegation requests a brief recess to consult with our home government, Kethvar announced. This was diplomatic language for reconsidering their position, and other representatives immediately understood the significance. The Veltar delegation began harmonizing in complex patterns that grew more intense as their discussion continued. Zaltek's crystalline form showed color shifts that indicated deep uncertainty about the course of action they had planned. His species had been one of the primary organizers of the alliance, but they were also known for changing positions quickly when new information became available. The Nethex pulsed with rapid electromagnetic patterns as they recalculated the strategic situation. As mathematical thinkers, they were reassessing the probability matrices that had led them to join the alliance. Military forces designed around absolute loyalty created different threat profiles than forces designed for territorial expansion. The Karathi delegate remained motionless, but Jake could see subtle changes in her posture that suggested intense internal communication with the hive mind. The collective consciousness was processing the human military doctrine through millions of individual perspectives. Jake Morrison entered the council chamber exactly 24 hours after the ultimatum had been delivered. The massive arena was fuller than the day before, with additional observers from species that had not been part of the original alliance. Word had spread throughout Nexus Station that something significant was happening, and diplomatic representatives who normally avoided controversial sessions had decided to attend. The lighting seemed harsher today, and Jake noticed that security personnel were positioned at every entrance. Several of the alien species had brought military advisors who sat in the upper tiers, their uniforms and decorations marking them as experienced warriors. The Drakmori delegation had doubled in size, with General Vraktar occupying a prominent position near the front of their section. Jake carried only a small audio device about the size of a human smartphone. The simplicity of his preparation had caused confusion among the alien representatives, many of whom had expected hover carts full of documentation and multiple assistants carrying data tablets. Instead, the human delegation consisted of Jake, alone. Walking calmly to the center of the chamber floor, Council Leader Zalthek called the session to order, his crystalline form reflecting the harsh lights in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Captain Morrison," he said, "this council has gathered to receive your complete response to our requirements. We expect full documentation of Earth's military doctrine, including strategic plans, weapon specifications, training protocols, and command structures." Jake stood in the center of the chamber and felt the attention of hundreds of beings focused on him. Representatives from dozens of species watched from the tiered seating, while recording devices captured every word and gesture for transmission across the galaxy. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would be studied and analyzed by military experts and political leaders on thousands of worlds. "Honored council members," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. "I have brought Earth's complete military doctrine as requested." A murmur of conversation rippled through the assembled representatives. The Veltar delegation exchanged rapid communications in their chime-like language, while the Karathi buzzed among themselves in patterns that seemed agitated. Several species began activating recording equipment and data analysis systems, preparing to process the expected flood of information. Zalthek raised one crystalline hand for silence. "Present your documentation," he commanded. Jake held up the small audio device. "This contains everything you need to understand human military doctrine," he said. "The complete philosophy that guides every decision we make regarding defense, strategy, and military action." Representative Kethvar of the Zephyrians writhed his tentacles in confusion. "That device cannot contain the documentation we specified," he said. "We require detailed analysis of your strategic planning, force deployment patterns, and operational procedures." "All of that stems from one principle," Jake replied. "Everything else is just application of that principle to different situations." General Vraktar of the Drakmori rose from his seat, his scaled form towering over the other delegates. "The humans mock this council," he hissed. "They were given clear requirements and have chosen to ignore them. This proves they cannot be trusted to operate within civilized parameters." Other representatives began voicing similar objections. The Nethex pulsed with electromagnetic patterns that translated as expressions of frustration, while several of the smaller species seemed genuinely confused by the unexpected turn of events. The chamber filled with overlapping translations, as dozens of languages competed for attention. Jake waited for the noise to subside before speaking again. "I request permission to play this recording for the council," he said. "It will take 12 seconds." The request was so simple and unexpected that it created a moment of silence. 12 seconds was barely enough time for most species to complete a formal greeting, let alone explain complex military strategies. The alien representatives looked at each other uncertainly, unsure how to respond to such an unusual situation. Zalthek's crystalline features showed patterns that indicated deep thought. As the council leader, he was responsible for maintaining order and ensuring that all diplomatic protocols were followed properly. The humans had technically fulfilled the requirement to present their military doctrine, even if the format was not what anyone had expected. "You may proceed," Zalthek said finally. "But understand that this council will not be satisfied with symbolic gestures. We require substance, not poetry." Jake activated the audio device and set it on the small podium that had been provided for speakers. The chamber's sound system amplified the recording, sending it clearly to every seat in the arena. For a moment, there was only silence as the file loaded and began to play. Then a human voice filled the chamber, strong and clear, speaking words that had been repeated by soldiers for generations. "I will never leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy, and under no circumstances will I ever embarrass my country." The recording ended, and silence returned to the chamber. Jake retrieved the device and looked up at the hundreds of alien faces staring down at him. Some showed confusion, others displayed what might have been curiosity, and a few seemed genuinely surprised by the simplicity of the message. Representative Kethvar was the first to speak. "This explains nothing," he said. "These are words, not military doctrine. We require technical specifications and strategic analysis." Jake nodded as if he had expected this response. "That 12-second recording contains everything you need to know about human military capabilities and intentions," he said. "Every ship we build, every weapon we design, every soldier we train, every battle plan we create, all of it serves one purpose: making sure we can keep that promise." The Karathi delegate clicked and buzzed rapid questions. "Define the operational parameters of never leave," she demanded. "What constitutes acceptable risk levels for retrieval operations? How do you calculate cost-benefit ratios for individual unit recovery?" "There are no acceptable risk levels," Jake replied. "There are no cost-benefit calculations. If one of our people falls into enemy hands, we will come for them. Period." General Vraktar laughed, a sound like grinding stone that echoed through the chamber. "Impossible," he said. "No military can operate without acceptable loss parameters. Strategic logic requires sacrifice of individual units for larger objectives." Jake turned to face the Drakmori general directly. "That's where you're wrong," he said. "Human military doctrine doesn't accept acceptable losses. We accept necessary sacrifices when there's absolutely no alternative. But we never stop trying to bring everyone home. That's why our ships are built like fortresses and our soldiers train for impossible odds. Not because we want to conquer others, but because we need to be strong enough to get to our people when they need us." The chamber fell silent again as the implications began to sink in. Jake continued speaking, his voice steady and calm despite the importance of the moment. "Every human who puts on a uniform knows that their comrades will never abandon them. No matter how dangerous the rescue mission, no matter how long it takes, no matter what the odds, someone will come. That knowledge makes us willing to fight when others would surrender, to take risks that other species would consider suicidal, to keep going when logic says we should quit." The Veltar delegation began rapid communications among themselves, their chiming voices creating complex harmonies. Other species were doing the same, as translators worked to convey concepts that had no direct equivalence in their languages. The idea of military doctrine based on absolute loyalty rather than strategic calculation was foreign to most galactic civilizations. This creates tactical unpredictability, the Netheks observed, their electronic voices flat and analytical. Military units operating under such parameters cannot be modeled using standard strategic algorithms. "That's right," Jake agreed. "You can't predict human behavior using normal military logic because we don't operate under normal military logic. We operate under the principle that no one gets left behind." Jake walked slowly around the chamber floor, making eye contact with representatives from different species. "You asked why we build so many ships and train so many soldiers," he said. "It's because rescue missions are expensive. Getting to someone who's trapped behind enemy lines takes overwhelming force. Recovering people from impossible situations requires impossible capabilities." The alien representatives were beginning to understand. The Zephyrians, who had evolved in cooperative ocean environments, seemed to grasp the concept more quickly than others. Their tentacles moved in patterns that indicated deep consideration. The Karathi, with their hive mind structure, appeared to be having more difficulty processing the idea of individual value overriding collective efficiency. "You're telling us," Zalthek said slowly, "that your entire military structure is designed around rescue operations?" "Not just rescue operations," Jake replied, "but the capability to conduct rescue operations under any circumstances. That requires ships that can—" Jake Morrison walked through the docking tube that connected Nexus Station to his ship with slow, deliberate steps. The UNS Liberty was not the largest vessel in the docking bay, but it was built like a fortress. Thick armor plating covered every surface, and weapon ports were visible along the hull even when the guns were retracted. Other species had commented on the aggressive design of human ships, but Jake knew the real reason behind it. Humans built ships like they built everything else, to last through whatever hell the universe could throw at them. The Liberty's crew of 30 was small by galactic standards, but Jake trusted every person aboard. They had served together for 3 years, fighting pirates in the outer systems and protecting human colonies from raiders. Each crew member was trained for multiple roles, and all of them knew how to fight if necessary. That was another thing that made other species nervous about humans. Most civilizations had specialists who did one job well, but humans seemed to expect everyone to be ready for anything. Commander Lisa Parker was waiting for him in the briefing room. She was reviewing intelligence reports on a holographic display, her fingers moving quickly across the data streams. Lisa had served in the Earth Defense Forces for 15 years before joining the Diplomatic Corps, and she understood both military strategy and political maneuvering better than most people Jake knew. "How bad was it?" she asked without looking up from the reports. Jake sat down heavily in the chair across from her. "Worse than we expected," he said. "They want complete documentation of our military doctrine, weapon specifications, training protocols, and command structure. They're also demanding the right to station monitors at our shipyards and training facilities." Lisa finally looked at him, her expression grim. "They're asking for our surrender without calling it that," she said. "No military in the galaxy would agree to those terms." "That's the point," Jake replied. "They're not expecting us to agree. They want an excuse to take action against Earth." The holographic display showed detailed profiles of the 7 species in the Alliance. Lisa gestured to the Drakmori section, which listed dozens of conquered worlds. "General Vraktar has been planning this for months," she said. "Intelligence suggests he convinced the others that humanity represents a long-term threat to galactic stability." Jake studied the information floating in the air between them. The Drakmori Empire controlled nearly 200 star systems through military conquest and intimidation. They had absorbed smaller civilizations for over 1,000 years, always, claiming it was necessary for peace and order. The other species in the Alliance had either been conquered by the Drakmori or learned to cooperate with them to avoid that fate. "What about the others?" Jake asked. "Are they all committed to this course of action?" Lisa highlighted different sections of the display. "The Veltar and Zephyrians seem genuinely concerned about our military buildup," she said. They've been asking questions through diplomatic channels for months. The Karathi are harder to read because of their hive mind structure, but they appear to view us as unpredictable variables that need to be controlled. The Netheks were shown as energy beings who had evolved past physical form millions of years. Ago. They communicated through electromagnetic pulses and saw the universe in terms of energy patterns and flow dynamics. The Netheks probably don't understand human behavior at all, Lisa continued. We don't fit their mathematical models for civilized species. Jake leaned back in his chair and looked at the data. Earth had been in contact with galactic civilization for only 5 years, but they had already made both friends and enemies. Human trade goods were popular in many systems, and Earth's willingness to fight pirates had earned respect from species that valued courage. However, their rapid military expansion had worried others who preferred predictable, controllable neighbors. They don't understand why we build so many weapons, Jake said. They think we're planning for conquest. Are we? Lisa asked. Jake considered the question seriously. Earth had built more warships in the past 5 years than some species constructed. In decades, human colonies were defended by orbital fortresses and ground-based weapon systems that could stop entire fleets. Military academies on Earth were graduating officers at 3 times the rate of most other worlds. We're planning for survival, Jake said finally. Humans have been through too much to trust that peace will last forever. Lisa nodded and called up historical files from Earth's databases. The display showed images and data from humanity's past. The world wars, the nuclear standoff, the climate disasters, the asteroid impact that nearly ended civilization in 2157. Each crisis had pushed humanity to the edge of extinction, but they had survived by becoming stronger and more prepared for the next threat. Other species haven't faced the same pressures, Lisa said. The Veltar evolved on a world with abundant resources and no major predators. The Zephyrians developed in ocean environments where cooperation was more valuable than competition. Most galactic civilizations had relatively peaceful histories compared to Earth. Jake studied the images of human history. Wars, disasters, and near-extinction events had taught his species that the universe was dangerous and that only the prepared would survive. Every human child learned about the times when civilization had almost collapsed and how people had fought to rebuild from the ashes. That history shaped how humans approached everything, including their relationships with alien species. They see our military preparations as aggression, Jake said. We see them as basic survival necessities. The question is how to make them understand that difference, Lisa replied. You said you requested access to their audio systems. What are you planning? Jake was quiet for a long moment. He had been thinking about this problem for weeks, ever since intelligence reports first suggested that multiple species were coordinating against Earth. The standard diplomatic approach would be to present detailed explanations, historical context, and rational arguments for human policy. That might work with some species, but not with a hostile alliance that had already made up their minds. I'm going to play them something, Jake said. 12 seconds of audio that explains everything they need to know about human military doctrine. Lisa raised an eyebrow. 12 seconds? How can you explain our entire military philosophy in 12 seconds? Jake smiled for the first time since returning from the council chamber. Because it's not complicated, he said. Everything we do, every ship we build, every soldier we train, every weapon we design, all comes down to one simple principle. He activated his personal datapad and scrolled through Earth's military archives. The files contained thousands of documents spanning centuries of human warfare and military development, rules of engagement, tactical manuals, strategic planning guides, and historical analyses filled terabytes of storage space. But Jake was looking for something much simpler. "Here," he said, highlighting a specific audio file. "This is from the U.S. Army Ranger Creed, recorded at a graduation ceremony in 2287. Every human soldier learns these words, and they guide everything we do in military situations." Lisa looked at the file information. 12 seconds exactly, she said. "What does it say?" Jake played the recording. A strong, clear voice filled the briefing room with words that had echoed through human military training for generations. "I will never leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy, and under no circumstances will I ever embarrass my country." The recording ended, and the room fell silent. Lisa stared at Jake with understanding slowly dawning in her eyes. "That's it," she said. "That's why we build the ships and train the soldiers and prepare for everything. Not for conquest or expansion, but because we never leave anyone behind." Jake nodded. "Every human in uniform knows that if they fall in battle, their comrades will come for them. No matter the odds, no matter the cost, no matter how dangerous the rescue mission might be. We don't fight for glory or territory. We fight for each other." Lisa was quiet for a moment, thinking through the implications. "The other species don't operate that way," she said. "The Karathi sacrifice individual units for the good of the hive. The Drakmori rule through fear and abandon the weak. Most galactic militaries accept acceptable losses as part of their strategic planning. But humans don't accept acceptable losses," Jake said. "We accept necessary sacrifices when there's no choice, but we never stop trying to bring everyone home. That's why we need heavy armor and powerful weapons and overwhelming force. Not to conquer others, but to make sure we can get to our people when they need us." The briefing room's lights dimmed automatically as the station's day cycle shifted to night mode. Jake and Lisa sat in the soft illumination, both thinking about the presentation that would determine Earth's future relationship with the galaxy. "Do you think it will work?" Lisa asked. Jake stood up and walked to the viewport that looked out at the massive space station. Hundreds of ships from dozens of species were docked at various levels, representing the diversity of galactic civilization. Some of those species might become humanity's enemies after tomorrow, while others might finally understand what drove human behavior. "It has to work," Jake said, "because if it doesn't, we'll have to prove our doctrine the hard way." Captain Jake Morrison stood in the center of the massive council chamber and felt the weight of 7 alien species staring down at him. The chamber was built like an arena with curved walls that rose up in tiers, and each level held the representatives of different worlds. The lighting was harsh and white, making everything look cold and unwelcoming. Jake kept his hands at his sides and his back straight as he waited for the session to begin. The human delegation was small compared to the others. Jake had brought only 3 people with him to Nexus Station, while some of the alien species had entire fleets waiting outside. The Drakmori had arrived with 12 warships, their reptilian crews visible through the viewing ports of the station. The Karathi brought their hive ships that looked like floating cities made of metal and chitin. Even the peaceful Zephyrians had shown up with more vessels than Earth had sent. Council leader Zalthek of the Veltar called the session to order. His crystalline body caught the light and threw rainbows across the chamber walls. When he spoke, his voice echoed with a sound like wind chimes in a storm. "We gather today to address the human question," he said. "For too long, this species has been allowed to operate without oversight. Their military preparations have grown beyond what any civilized world should possess. Jake listened without changing his expression. He had expected this day to come. Eventually. Earth had been making friends and enemies in equal measure since joining the galactic community 5 years ago. Some species welcomed human trade and technology, but others saw Earth as a threat that needed to be controlled. Representative Kethvar of the Zephyrians rose from his water-filled speaking pod. His tentacles moved in patterns that Jake's translator converted to words. The humans build weapons that serve no defensive purpose, he said. Their ship designs prioritize armor and firepower over exploration or commerce. They train soldiers at a rate that suggests preparation for major conflicts. The Karathi delegate was next to speak. She looked like a giant insect wearing armor made of living metal. Her compound eyes focused on Jake as she clicked and buzzed her words. Human military doctrine emphasizes individual combat effectiveness over collective strategy. This creates unpredictable variables in any conflict scenario. The hive requires predictable outcomes. One by one, the other species presented their concerns. The Netheks, beings made of pure energy contained in mechanical bodies, worried about human aggression patterns. The Veltar cited violations of peaceful expansion protocols. The Drakmori, who ruled half the galaxy through conquest, complained that humans refused to acknowledge their superior position in the hierarchy of civilizations. Jake waded through all of it. He had heard these complaints before in smaller meetings and diplomatic channels. What surprised him was seeing them all together like this. 7 major species had formed an alliance specifically to deal with what they called the human problem. That was either very flattering or very dangerous, and Jake suspected it was both. When the complaints were finished, Zalthek spoke again. "The evidence is clear," he said. "Humanity has developed military capabilities far beyond what their current territory and population should require. They have refused multiple requests to explain their strategic doctrine or submit to standard galactic military oversight. This behavior threatens the stability that has kept peace in this region for over 3,000 years." The chamber fell, silent except for the humming of the life support systems. Jake could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He knew that whatever he said next would determine whether Earth faced economic sanctions, military action, or something worse. The Alliance had already cut off trade with 12 systems that refused to limit their contact with human colonies. "Captain Morrison," Zalthek continued, "you will provide this council with complete documentation of Earth's military doctrine within 24 hours. This must include strategic planning documents, weapon specifications, training protocols, and command structure analysis. You will also submit to questioning by military experts from each represented species." Jake felt the temperature in the chamber drop several degrees. The demand was impossible to meet, and everyone in the room knew it. No military in the galaxy would hand over their complete strategic doctrine to potential enemies. The Alliance was asking for something they knew Earth could not provide, which meant they were looking for an excuse to take action. Furthermore, Zalthek said, Earth must agree to limit military production to levels appropriate for a species of your size and territorial holdings. Independent monitors will be stationed at all major human shipyards and training facilities. Any expansion of military capabilities beyond approved limits will result in immediate intervention. The Drakmori representative hissed his approval. General Vraktar was known throughout the galaxy as a conqueror who had personally led the subjugation of 40 worlds. His scaled face showed the kind of smile that predators wore when cornering prey. "The humans have had their time to prove they could be trusted," he said. They have chosen the path of militarization over cooperation. Now they face the consequences of that choice. Jake looked around the chamber at the faces staring down at him. Some showed curiosity, others displayed anger or fear. A few seemed almost sympathetic, but none of them spoke up to object to the demands. The Alliance had clearly planned this confrontation carefully, and they expected complete submission. "You have 24 hours," Zalthek repeated. "Failure to comply will result in economic sanctions against all human colonies and trade partners. Continued resistance will be met with military action to protect the stability of the galactic community." Jake finally spoke. His voice was calm and steady, carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. "I request permission to present Earth's position tomorrow," he said. "I will need access to your audio systems for my presentation." The alien representatives exchanged glances. Several of them began speaking in their native languages, creating a buzz of conversation that the translators could not keep up with. Jake caught fragments of different discussions, but the general tone seemed to be confusion about his simple request. Zalthek raised one crystalline hand for silence. "You may use our communication systems," he said, "but understand that we expect full compliance with our demands. Your presentation must include complete documentation as specified, or this council will authorize immediate action against human territories." Jake nodded once. "Understood," he said. "I will be ready tomorrow." As the session was called to recess, Jake walked toward the exit with measured steps. He could feel hundreds of alien eyes watching his every move. Some of the representatives were already making private communications, probably coordinating their next moves based on how they expected the human response to go. The corridor outside. The chamber was filled with diplomatic staff and security personnel from different species. Jake noticed that several of the guards were positioned to watch him specifically, though they tried to make it look casual. The message was clear. Earth's representative was being treated more like a prisoner than a diplomat. Jake made his way back to the docking bay where his ship waited. Tomorrow would determine whether humanity faced isolation, conquest, or something else entirely. He had one chance to change the minds of 7 hostile species, and he planned to use exactly 12 seconds to do it.